Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on challenges to American democracy. And I would, in parentheses, include actually all of society, not just democracy in terms of the political system, but actually institutionally and societally. And that's what we are going to look at today from an overview perspective. I would like to begin by noting that in January 2020, just a couple of months before COVID-19 erupted in the United States and gradually into Europe, the New York Times ran an article entitled that something to the effect that Americans have lost faith in everything. And the author indicated that the American people, at least a segment of it, and of course this is based on public opinion polling, the American people, in fact, have lost confidence in public and private sector institutions. It's not just that they have lost confidence in democracy, and it is not the case, as the mainstream media, mainstream analysts, including academics, by the way, regrettably, business people, community leaders, it is not the case that they have lost confidence in one party, namely the GOP, and its recent right-wing course under Trump. By recent, I mean since 2016, although as we will see today, that goes way back. It doesn't start with Trump. It goes back to Goldwater in '64. And then Reagan and Trump is just continuing. The crisis, according to this article, is one that has very far-reaching social dimensions, not just political, but social dimensions. There is a sense, according to the New York Times, this article in 2020, that the American people feel a sense of alienation, a sense of despair, hopelessness. The author points, of course, to suicides, which actually have risen since then. Obviously, substance abuse, from alcohol to legal and illegal narcotics. A sense that the American dream, and here's where we wrap the whole thing up, around the American dream that gave the American people a sense of hope. Historically, the American dream gave the American people a sense of hope for the future. Maybe they wouldn't realize the American dream, but their children would. The so-called American dream hope really is predicated on the upward social mobility of future generations. Okay, maybe I'm an auto worker. I work in a transmission plant for Chrysler, but my children are going to go to college. They're going to have good paying jobs in an office somewhere or have their own small business, right? That sense of hope, according to the New York Times, was disappearing. We do see in public opinion poll, especially the more respectable, the Pew Research Center, but others as well. I don't mean to say that the others are not respectable by any means. But we do see that there is, especially since the Great Recession of 2008, a decline in the belief that the future is going to be better for our generation and our children's generation than it was for our parents. That is not the case. That, on the contrary, people tend to be pessimistic. Now, the pessimism also comes from the fact that in the 1990s, there was a convergence of domestic and foreign factors. And I want to zero in on this because the hopelessness in America and the challenges to American society, institutional challenges, not just to democracy, are really have to do with the gap between the expectations of the American people, the expectations being way up here, especially in the 1990s, okay? The decade when there was no more, the end of the Cold War, there was no more USSR, the Soviet Union and its entire bloc of alliances collapsed. All of those countries integrated into the world capitalist economy. Okay, that's one reality. The second one was that the United States, as President Bush, the father, not George W., the father announced in '91, I believe, a new world order. We have a new world order based in the United States, so-called rules-based order. Who determines the rules? The United States, because it was the sole superpower that survived. This comes in the decade of the internet, the decade when high-tech industries promises a lot. One world economy. Corporations are euphoric about the future. They're going to make a lot of money because markets, not only in the former Soviet Union, open up for raw materials and selling products from the West, but China, the big issue was China. China's opening of its markets and its integration into the world economy. That too, a huge stimulus to the US-based Western capitalist system. In fact, two major thinkers of the time, Samuel Huntington from Harvard, and the other was Francis Fukuyama, wrote books somewhat related. Samuel Huntington's work was the third wave democracy, that in fact history shows of the Western world and in fact the rest of the world that we go in waves of democracy, and we were in a third wave democracy, and he was euphoric about the end of the Soviet Union, and that in fact three countries that had dictatorships, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, Greece since 67, the other ones, Spain since Franco in the 1930s, since the Civil War of the 1930s, 1939, and of course Portugal since the early 30s, since Antonio Salazar and that regime. All three Southern European countries, Spain, Portugal, Greece, democratized. There was a wave of democracy. In fact, Brazil and Argentina were democratizing. Now, did Samuel Huntington and those following him, and those euphoric about the Huntington thesis of democratization, confuse the word democracy with capitalism? In fact, neoliberal capitalism, because it was entrenched at the time that both Huntington and I'll come to Fukuyama and Fukuyama were writing. So what we have here is an intellectual who argues that the world is democratizing, and who is the center of the world? President George Bush announced it was the U.S. The U.S. is the center of the world. It is the sole power that determines the world order. It makes the rules. There are still references to the rules-based order when it comes to talking about the wars, the proxy war of NATO up in Ukraine and the one in Israel, behind which are, of course, the US and Western countries. There was a kind of euphoria. People thought, wow, we have no enemies, except that the Cold War was not over. It was temporarily suspended. And when 9/11 took place, that is the terrorist attack by jihadists, Saudi-based jihadists in New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington, the Osama bin Laden group, okay, when that took place, there was a new war, and it was the war on terror. And once that wanes, after, of course, it proves a manufactured failure, then we are back in the Cold War. And this time it's Russia and China, and especially China, who are at the bullseye. They're the target, the main target, as last week's NATO meeting in Washington, D.C. clearly showed. So what we have is expectations in the 90s that the United States was riding high. And in the late 90s, I believe it was in the late 90s, Fukuyama writes this book, The End of History. And of course, he's celebrating what? Everybody, bestseller, everybody ate it up. What end of history? In other words, this was a term that Marx used, by the way. In other words, this teleological, teleological is a Greek word which means, telos means the end. The idea that from here on, we have permanently until the end of time, liberal bourgeois democracy under what? Under the neoliberal, because that's what existed, that's what still exists today, under the neoliberal political economy. History, not just me, not what anyone says. History, empirical reality, and the fact that the United States and Japan and its part and the G7 have backtracked on neoliberalism because it turns out that it helped China much more than the West. History has demonstrated that all of those were false hopes and delusions in the 1990s. None of it was real. It was all theoretical, manufactured constructs. None of it was real. The reality is that the end of the Soviet bloc, taking place concurrently with the rise of China to globalism, actually helped China, not the United States. The United States has been in decline. There is the Great Recession of 2008 clearly showed that. Okay. The COVID-19 crisis, which was not well managed at all by anybody's account, and the resort to military solutions to just about everything when there are political solutions, diplomatic alternatives to fighting an actual war through proxy states, whether it's Ukraine or Israel, this proves a deep crisis in the Western liberal democracy. there is a crisis. I want to stress that there is a crisis in the United States, which is far deeper than the cult of personalities that the mass media and analysts insist on. And that it's a crisis between Democrats and Republicans, when in fact they both support the same goals, not the same strategies on how to achieve those goals. History has demonstrated this. Not just now, but ever since Reagan took over and introduces neoliberalism, Clinton continued it and actually went a step further. Obama did after George W. Bush. Okay, Biden has after Trump. So the goals are the same. The goals of the two political parties are the same. They differ on cultural issues. They differ on identity politics. They differ on lifestyle issues. Yes. And they try to portray the larger problem of the institutional crisis in the United States as part of the culture wars problem. It's culture wars, when in fact, it's a far-reaching and much deeper problem that goes to the heart of the social contract in the United States. There is an erosion of the bourgeois liberal democracy consensus in the United States, and that is at the heart of the crisis. Such an erosion of the bourgeois liberal consensus took place in Italy from the end of World War I until Mussolini was invited by King Emmanuel II to take power as Prime Minister of Italy, and then he was lawfully elected and introduces fascism in Italy in the 1920s and stays until, of course, through the war. There was a similar crisis in Germany under the Weimar Republic in the late 30s, early 1930s, and Adolf Hitler comes to power with the blessing of the capitalist class and the military elites and the aristocrats in Germany, the landowning aristocrats, the bankers, the industrialists. They agreed after he promises to cater to their needs. The kind of crisis that interwar Europe, especially these two countries, but interwar Europe as a whole, was experiencing a crisis. The crisis of liberal bourgeois democracy. That's the crisis the US is facing. It's analogous to that. It's not limited to culture wars. It's not limited to personalities. Biden has health issues, which he might, and he may not, I don't know. Trump is too far to the right and openly flirts with fascism. That's not the issue. The issue is a much deeper crisis of the social contract and the disintegration of the liberal bourgeois consensus amid a neoliberal political economy, which has a long-standing class warfare against the working class, by the way, not just in the United States, but globally. There are inter-elite rivalries. And as the elites realize that they have to preserve the status, the social status, and their privileges, they don't want to lose anything, not going to give up anything, right? Billionaires against raising the minimum wage. Billionaires against raising the minimum wage in return for market equilibrium, to use John Maynard Keynes' terminology, and social harmony. They're not. They just want to keep what they have and accumulate even more. And the crisis of neoliberalism is what is behind the challenges that American democracy and American society is facing. Okay. Now, just for the record, I should tell you that many historians, I include myself in this group, argue that 1815 to 1914, in other words, from the Napoleonic Wars until the outbreak of World War I, this is the century of Britain. This is the English century. of global supremacy. England was at the top of the world, right? Roughly 19th century, early 20th century. Germany challenged it. Germany challenged it. After Bismarck was dismissed by the Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1890, I believe, 91, something like that, 1890. You have a rivalry between England and Germany, and eventually the outbreak of World War I, in which the US was involved, and it comes out the major power. The American century starts from World War I until the end of the Vietnam War / Watergate crisis of the Nixon Ford team, although Ford had nothing to do with it, by the way, nothing to do with the Watergate. It was a Nixon operation. Anyway, so from the mid-1910s to the mid-1970s, you have the American century. And the height of the American century is, of course, that is the zenith of American power is experienced in the 1940s, especially from 45, during the Truman presidency, from 45 to 53, when Eisenhower takes office in 53. That is the zenith of American power. During that period, during the Truman presidency, the United States really had no rival. None. In 49, the Soviet Union announced that it had the bomb. Okay, then it had a rival in the atomic weapons domain, but no economic rival, no one. The US was the preeminent economic, political, and military power in the world. When we look today at the challenges that the United States has faced, and by the way, I want to say parenthetically, there is no utopian society. Human beings are not perfect; they're flawed. So the society they build is also flawed. Although I am a believer in the Enlightenment, in the rationalism of the Enlightenment, and I do believe that the intelligentsia of the Enlightenment was correct in arguing that institutional problems can be solved through rational process, and that leads to progress of humanity and to the betterment of humanity. I also want to make sure that people understand that the Enlightenment was the ideal. That does not mean that any society achieved that ideal. That was the ideal, and great for them that they introduced that ideal. The United States did experience, in my view, by the way, and some historians agree, others disagree with this, but in my view, the United States experienced 4 crises in its history. The first was right from the period it was founded all the way to the end of the Civil War. The issue of states' rights and the reality that the United States was not integrated because the South had a slave-based economy, which really helped England's industrialization. The South was selling primary products, especially cotton, obviously. But primary products it was selling to England, was doing big business with England. The North was in another universe. The North wanted to emulate the mother country, England, and industrialize. And what was preventing it was, in fact, the Southern economy that was based on agriculture. And to industrialize, the North needed integration. As Abraham Lincoln pointed out, he kept hammering the point of the integrity of the Union. He was absolutely right. The integrity of the Union included economic integration, by the way. You need a surplus labor force and mechanized agriculture, modernization of agriculture, to have industrial development. No society has undertaken industrial development, that is, developing the secondary sector of production, manufacturing, in the absence of first and simultaneously modernizing agriculture, reducing the percentage of the labor force involved in agriculture. So the United States had to do the same thing. The United States had to end slavery. Slavery was an anachronistic institution holding back industrial capitalism in the northern states, as well as the South, because eventually, obviously, the South, some of the companies moved down south. That was one crisis, the crisis of states' rights and the slave-based economy. That it was resolved with the end of slavery, with the Civil War. It was resolved through war and bloodshed, but it was resolved. The second crisis was really right after that, that's when the U.S. undertook industrial development, the era of the westward expansion, industrial capitalism, the railroads, the very rapid rise of urbanization, of America in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and rise of the trade unions and women's organizations and groups demanding rights for themselves and democracy for themselves, and not just limited to casting a vote. That's meaningless if you don't have everything. By the way, survival, as Charles Darwin, who lived at the time, survival is primary. The right to vote is fine as long as you have something to eat. This is not to diminish the right to vote. On the contrary, but material security is important for human beings. So the progressive movement presented the challenges because the monopoly capitalists at the time, this is the era of monopoly capitalism and the cartels. Those of you who have studied American history at the college level, you know this. This is the period when the government was under pressure to regulate capitalism as it was expanding very rapidly, and it needed regulation. Regulation was imminent. It had to regulate capitalism. There was resistance. Capitalists back then in the 19th century didn't want that. They don't want it today. In fact, let me point out, by the way, that many scholars point out that the era of neoliberalism today, in the last 40 years, is actually like the era of monopoly capitalism and cartels of the late 19th, early 20th century. That's an important point to mention, by the way. Anyway, the next crisis that the United States was faced with was the Great Depression. It was really up in the air which way the U.S. would go. Germany and Italy went the route of Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy before Germany. And then, of course, you have Southern Europe with dictatorships, right? Salazar, Franco, the dictatorship in Greece in 1936. Eastern Europe, much of Eastern Europe going authoritarian. So there is really, with the exception of France and England, there's not much democracy in Europe in the interwar period. The U.S., amid the Great Depression, could have gone the route of totalitarianism. It did not. They elected someone who had roots in the progressive movement of the late 19th, early 20th century, who believed in government as a vehicle for social development and economic development, and regulating the role of capitalists, who, as not just, by the way, Democrats at the time of the progressive era, but Republicans as well, Theodore Roosevelt included, believed that capitalists left to their own devices have self-destructive tendencies because greed leads to destruction, let alone to the destruction, for example, of other industries. Let me give you an example. Back then, the railroad companies were charging huge fees. Well, if the railroad sector, if the transportation sector takes a larger chunk out of the economy, think of the economy as a pie. If they take a larger chunk out of that pie, that means there's less left for the rest of the sectors in the economy. everything from agriculture to animal husbandry, forestry, mining, and so forth, who rely on transportation. They have to transport their stuff um, and to get it to the market. Okay, so regulating the market, rationalizing the market was imperative to prevent disequilibrium in the market, the erratic changes, the ups and downs. Now, the next crisis after the Great Depression was Vietnam. Vietnam, not just because of the war and the military solutions um, that the United States was looking for, and really of symbolic significance. I mean, what was it about Vietnam? Was it the rubber trees because Western companies wanted to make tires and other products from rubber? No, they could have let them have whatever government they wanted, let national sovereignty prevail, and then try to see if they can sign contracts with them to buy it. What are they going to do with the rubber? They have to sell it for somewhere. They can't. That's how is the economy going to survive? But it became an issue of ideological proportions. You know, this is the early Cold War. Better dead than red. Communism. And they viewed communism in Washington, as well as in much of the West, as a monolith, when in fact they found out, Kissinger of all people, as conservative as you can get, that it is not a monolith. It was not a monolith. There was a huge difference between Mao and Stalin, between Mao and Khrushchev. There was a difference between China and Russia. There was a difference between Vietnam and China. As we found out, obviously, China and Vietnam did not get along that well. Difference between Cuba and Russia. Difference between communist regimes, period. They had the nationalism, which they undermined in the West, within the communist system, was very important. Anyway, Vietnam was not just a militarist crisis in the United States. It was accompanied by the rise of Europe, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, economically in the world, on a world scale, and the gradual demise of the United States, which was spending a disproportionate amount, a huge amount of money on defense, just like it is today, going to the $1 trillion mark soon, by the way. Okay? Enormous amounts absorbed by the defense sector, which means you're taking it out of the civilian economy. It's got to come out of somewhere, and you're pushing it over to debt, public debt, which has to be paid. And if it has to be paid, that means that the currency, which was then pegged to the gold standard, declines, except that the U.S. currency was artificially valued. Nixon had to do something about that. I believe it was in 91. And you have a floating currency, a floating rate, exchange rate. And it was obvious that the United States chronic balance of payments deficit was a problem. That was a crisis. In the 1970s, a convergence of crises from Vietnam losing the Vietnam War, the dollar taking a dive, the oil crisis because the U.S. was supporting Israel as it is today, and OPEC retaliated with oil going up. And in 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini takes power in Iran, and you have Iran breaking off. It doesn't go with the Soviet Union, doesn't go with China. It's an Islamic republic, but it's not with the West. The US, ever since, by the way, demonized Iran. Instead of accepting the reality that Iran had a revolution, and rightly or wrongly, it's their business what regime they want. If the people of Iran want to have an Islamic republic, a communist government, a Norwegian progressive democracy style government, that's their business. The right to self-determination, a principle that the US claimed historically they believed in. self-determination, national self-determination. They denied it. Okay? Now, I'll come back. There's a reason I'm mentioning Iran. I'll come back to this point soon. So these are the issues historically. Then there is neoliberalism in the 1980s. And in the last 45 years, we've lived under neoliberalism. And it is under neoliberalism, which was supposed to be the best phase of capitalism and the savior of America. That's how it was presented in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan. That's who introduced it, institutionalized it, and his followers. The GOP became a Reagan party, just like the GOP is a Donald Trump party today. Reagan institutionalized neoliberalism, privatized, deregulate, privatize public assets, and give contracts to the public sector, deregulate, reduce taxes of corporations, reduce taxes to the rich, reduce the welfare program, fight any attempts to unionize workers, fight any attempts to have wage raises. By the way, if you look at U.S. Department of Labor statistics, you'll find out that from Reagan to the present, wages in real terms, in other words, accounting for inflation, have gone down. And at the same time, when you look at capital accumulation for the richest 1%, it has skyrocketed under neoliberalism. This is part of the crisis. The enormous inequality in income. And by the way, just in case you think that some institution in Moscow, some institute in Moscow is compiling the statistics, it's the Rand Corporation. The Rand Corporation, those who are familiar with it know it's a conservative institution. Doesn't matter whose statistics you look at, they're the same. Downward social mobility and income stagnation for the working class to downward pressure, and an erosion of the middle class. Therein rests the problem of challenges to American democracy and American institutions. That's part of the problem. What have the elites done to explain why we have the American elites, from political to media, and I'll come to that in connection with Trump, by the way, to media, to academics, most of them, not all, by the way. There are some fine academics that actually will call a spade a spade. They'll tell you the truth of what's going on. But in the post-truth era of fake news, it is amazing the blatant distortions that are out there by the elites and the American people, who, by the way, all of us are consumers of news. I don't exclude myself. I get up in the morning, I go to the internet, and I look at news from around the world, from Hong Kong to Paris, from CNN to BBC and so forth, and try to get a view of what news there is from around the world. Our consciousness of the world is shaped, our worldview is shaped by what's in the news. The American people mimic what the source of the crisis is, because they are consumers of the mass media. Let me come to the mass media. All of you know that there was a very tragic and to be strongly denounced, by the way, assassination attempt, any political assassination attempt, on former President Donald Trump by a young man who the FBI has done a thorough investigation and has concluded was acting alone. However, that did not stop the US government from feeding CNN, and then everybody took that story. BBC, European newspapers, European television, the Washington Post, the New York Times, everybody took the story and published it. The story argued that actually it was Iran that was probably very suspicious behind the plot. US officials were asked, can we see some proof? No. There was chatter. And actually we have intelligence from months ago that they were bitter about Trump because Trump did order the assassination. This is on the record, this is official, you can look it up for you, of the who was in charge of the Revolutionary Guard, this armed unit in Iran's armed forces. Iran immediately denounced this as malicious, completely baseless. Now, you would expect them to, of course. What are they going to say? Oh, yeah, we were behind it. But they denounced it strongly. The UN representative in New York denounced this. But you would say, well, why should we believe Iran? They're lying. Except for one thing, the FBI report. FBI unequivocally states that the young man was acting alone. He had no links to anything that has to do with Iran. Iran has said that, for the record, they do plan to go the legal route within their own judicial system and the International Court of Criminal Court, with regard to the assassination of Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, the general of the Revolutionary Guard. They have said that. Then USA Today comes, a prominent American newspaper, and says, by the way, here are the facts. No mention of Iran. CNN then has Fareed Zakaria, one of its reporters, interview the foreign minister of Iran, and they asks him right off the bat, were you people behind the assassination? The foreign minister refused to answer the question and simply said, this is our policy. We are only interested in a legal solution, not in political assassinations, legal solution. Then CNN itself publishes a story. Headline was it trying to give the impression that somehow Iran, they didn't really make a mistake. They were not manipulating, manufacturing stories on behalf of the US government amid the genocide, as the International Court has concluded, not me, the International Court and international human rights organizations, the genocide in Gaza. This is a matter of record. This is not to pass judgment, but that's what is happening over there. They're killing children, women, civilians in Gaza. They have been since October. Okay? That's a matter of record. The UN statements, even if you take the International Court, which is an arm of the UN, out of the equation, the UN has had representatives who have said they're committing war crimes and genocide. So CNN publishes a story again mentioning, trying to imply Iran. Then when you read the story, there's one line which says, by the way, there is no connection between the young man, he was acting alone, and Iran. And yet the headline says something different. Tries to imply that there's something different. So what we have is, this is not to fault CNN. CNN is doing its job as a network. And I am sure that CNN was given evidence that there was chatter, and there's always chatter. There are scenarios. The U.S., the CIA knows that they have all kinds of scenarios. All foreign intelligence services have scenarios, what they might do. However, if there were, in fact, evidence, empirical evidence, that Iran was behind the assassination attempt of Trump, we have to be realistic. The United States would have gone to the Security Council and it would have argued that he has the right to retaliate. After all, they tried to take out Trump. And they're right. You try to assassinate a former president, any American, well, it doesn't matter. Country has the right to defend that. They would be right. And again, I'm defending CNN in saying that, okay, they were given all of this information. The question is, the editor should have said, wait a minute, what do you really have here? What do you have? And if you have such evidence, why don't you take it to an international arena, present it? Is the job of the CNN to do what the United Nations Security Council is supposed to be doing? Is that it? Anyway, this is one example. The second example I want to bring up is also relates to Trump. And it has to do, this is a crisis. By the way, the reason I'm bringing up this example is because it has nothing to do with the media, in which the American people have cast their vote on what they think of the media, how credible it is. This is about the institutional crisis that exists. There's a reason why people have such a low level of confidence in their institutions, and the media is one of them. They don't level with them. They are less than honest with them. And then they turn around and they fact check their rival, Fox News. And I'm not defending Fox News. God knows they have their problems. And they manipulate stories all the time. But this is a far-reaching problem. It's a wide problem. Now, another story related to Trump. A federal judge recently, her name is Eileen Cannon, ruled in favor of Trump on the issue. She's been on a number of cases involving Trump. She's a Florida judge, by the way, appointed by Trump, registered Republican. She ruled in favor of Trump in the case of his taking documents out of the White House that he was not supposed to. Let me explain that as a researcher for decades, I was going to presidential libraries and national archives and so forth, World Bank, IMF archives all the time, because that was my job, to gather materials so I can write books and articles. What happens, the procedure, and this is why I happen to know this firsthand, the procedure is the official documents, unless it's something personal, unless, for example, Bill Gates sends you a letter to you as president, if it's an official document on policy, that's government property. That stays. That's public property. That goes to the archives. You don't take it. Now, he took documents. The Department of Justice under Merrick Garland, the U.S. Attorney General, Biden appointee, obviously, went after Trump on this issue. They're now appealing the case because the judge ruled in favor of Trump. The judge was appointed, and this goes to the crisis of the institutions in America and why there is a challenge to American democracy and American institutions today. The judge happened to be not only a registered Republican, not only connected to the senators from Florida and to the governor of Florida, but a member of the Federalist Society. The judge, those of you who don't know about that society, it is a right-wing group, I believe founded in 1982 by Yale and the University of Chicago. I think it was 1980 or 1982. And the group is devoted to promoting right-wing causes, and it is funded by the Koch brothers and some of the most influential billionaires and multimillionaires in the United States. Those of you who follow politics in America know that the Federalist Society has been very influential. They give names of candidates that they want on the bench to senators, to representatives in the House, and of course to the White House. These are the people who want. This is one of the candidates. This is one of the people that they wanted on the bench. Okay. Well, what is it that they want? They are supporters of the neoliberal political economy that is less taxes, less regulation, more privatization, militarism as a solution to political crisis. Okay, and generally supporting right-wing causes, and right-wing causes from everything from social, cultural issues to economic. Okay, this is who they are. This is the reason I'm mentioning this, because the Supreme Court is also packed with people like this. The Supreme Court of the United States recently ruled, and Biden, of course, even Biden had to say something. Biden came out and said, wait a minute. They ruled that Trump was actually exempt from any prosecution, and basically declaring something like a Jacksonian imperial presidency, where the executive branch is tantamount to being above the law. This happened this year. Now, they didn't say that. They did argue that the sitting president is exempt from prosecution. When the judicial branch is on the side of promoting what appears to be, and if it appears to be, it is, authoritarianism. An imperial presidency, by the way, is the road to authoritarianism. The United States was founded on the principle of division, separation of powers, and balance between the branches of government, not on concentrated power at the executive branch. The executive branch concentration of power leads to authoritarianism. Trump has made no secret that he supports this trend toward an imperial presidency. This is alarming. This is another challenge to American democracy and the American institutions. I want to turn now to public opinion polls, and then I'll give you some. Actually, before I come to let me do the public opinion polls. In the last 4 years, under Biden, there have been a number of. I'm just going to stick on the Biden. There have been a number of public opinion polls indicating that the overwhelming majority of the American people believe that the United States is going to become authoritarian. The overwhelming majority. It's in something like 2/3 to 3/4. Some believe that it is already authoritarian right now in its policies. One alarming issue that was raised was how many believe what are the strong points of the United States. 34%. This was in September 2023. This is a Pew Research Center poll. This is one of my favorites because it indicates that 34% answered The question was, how many Americans believe that the US has strong points as a society? 34%, a third of the entire population answered, I don't know. Okay. 24% answered, it doesn't have any strong points. You have almost 60% of the population saying that I don't know if I'm not sure it has any or it doesn't have any. And then only a small percentage answered the system of government and the freedom to vote, the right to vote. Okay, they did answer that. That was 10% of the people. And then we have 29% answering that they valued freedom and democracy. Now, in another poll, 32% answered that they prefer authoritarianism. This is to be contrasted with about 2/3 of the population who expect the United States to be authoritarian. 1/3 prefer authoritarianism right now. This is a crisis of democracy and institutions because they know, people know that the policies impacting their lives are not that far off from authoritarianism. They feel powerless. Just like, remember at the very first thing I said in opening this session is I pointed to the New York Times article in January 2020 where this article, most American people feel alienated. They feel that they have no power, they have no hope, the American dream is gone. That sense of powerlessness, that Wall Street has all the power and the military-industrial complex has all the power. They feel powerless. They feel alienated. They feel that their children are not going to grow up in the kind of society that their parents grew up. This is a crisis of confidence in the entire institutional structure, not just in one brand, not just in Trump versus Biden. That's nonsense, by the way. That cult of personality is nonsense that the media manufactures to distract people from systemic issues, from the social contract, because the entire system, everything from Wall Street, that people that come for this, like Senator Bernie Sanders says, the Wall Street is rigged, the economy is rigged, to religious institutions, by the way, where you have the heads of some of these large mega churches who are headed by millionaires riding in private planes and expensive luxury cars, living in mansions and preaching modesty and preaching morality and spirituality while they are bathing in materialism. What is there to believe in? The educational system is another crisis. The educational system of the United States, especially higher education, is under the tight control, as those of you who have been following in the last half a year or so since the Israeli war broke out. If you've been following, you know that the large universities depend on endowments, and endowments are in the hands of millionaires and billionaires, and they decide the fate of universities. They've been getting rid of administrators and faculty and putting tight control on universities. You know that money buys not just influence, it buys institutional access. And if the majority don't have the money, they're outside the system. No wonder the New York Times article concluded that people feel alienated. They're not integrated into the system. They're not part of the democratic system, the institutional democracy that's supposed to be there. Now, I want to come to the issue of China and the future of American democracy. I have stated in writings as well, in my writings as well as in even videos that I have done, that I agree with the majority, with the wisdom of the majority of the American people, that the future of America is toward authoritarianism. It is regrettable and it is not inevitable. I don't want to sound fatalistic, but the country is headed that way. It doesn't matter that Biden decries the authoritarianism of Trump and argues that he's the one who's inviting authoritarianism. It doesn't matter that Obama and Hillary Clinton and Biden together are saying, you see, the GOP is the one responsible for inviting authoritarianism to America, this wonderful democracy in America. No. They, that is the Democratic Party, have an equal, if not greater responsibility than the Republicans. They have more or less been in power about the same. From 1980 to the present, there were Republican administrations in Congress and Republican controlled Congress, and there was also Democratic. Their policies didn't differ. Not in domestic, not in foreign policy. Just look at the last 4 years, look at the last 4 years of Trump, the first 4 years of Trump in his presidency, and the last 4 years of Biden in foreign policy. Biden pursued military solutions to regional crises which could have been solved through diplomatic channels. Knowing that in the end, and I've stated this before, there is only a political solution to a crisis. There is no forever war. Forever war, which is the slogan among neoconservatives that Biden has surrounded himself with. The forever war doctrine is self-destructive. No wonder the American people have no confidence in their government, because it is now the next budget of the Pentagon is going to be $1 trillion. In a $27 trillion economy, $1 trillion for the Pentagon. And it doesn't include, by the way, it's narrowly defined as 1 trillion. It's actually close to 1.7 trillion because they didn't include a lot of stuff that is for the Pentagon. They don't include, they put it in other departments. So this is a crisis that the US is facing. It is not inevitable that the US has to go down this road. It is not inevitable that the media has to be going down the route that it is. It is really regrettable that the media is not more self-reflective and examining the stories that the government feeds them, and just to take them. They have been especially discredited during the period of the war with Israel because the people who have a mind and people who compare how the US media treats the victims of war in Ukraine versus the victims of war in Gaza, it's very different. Ukrainians, white. Gaza, the Palestinians, non-white. Racism is the word that's used in the global South to describe media treatment of the two conflicts. Racism. The crisis is institutional because the institutions led by elites are corrupt. The solution is not Band-Aid fixes, and it's not to accuse. China had nothing to do with the government feeding a news organization a story about Iran, which turns out the news organization itself, in a backhanded kind of way, in a circuitous way, in a roundabout way, said, by the way, this guy was acting alone. Okay, fine. It has nothing to do with a judge down in Florida rendering a decision on Trump, taking documents. These are official documents. They belong to the archives, which didn't belong to him. And then the judge reprimanding the Department of Justice. That's not, what does China have to do, or Iran, or any country? Kind of distraction that has been used by the elites to blame somebody else, either domestic dissidents, dissident voices, by the way, or foreign enemies. You know, when, as a historian, I can tell you this was used, has been used in the past, from the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, all the way to the decline and fall of Rome, and of course down to the British-German conflict. In the past, historically, the elites in countries that refuse to take responsibility for their own actions blame somebody else. This is exactly what's happening in America. This is not new. The great Dutch scholar Johan Huizinga wrote in the 1930s, during the era of totalitarianism, that the elites become more callous, more vicious, more calculating, when they are afraid that their privileged status in society will erode somehow, because they see a crisis and they know someone is going to pay the price. That fear makes them more sadistic. Huizinga was absolutely right. What we're dealing with today are elites which are, to borrow the Huizinga thesis, which are on that route. And of course, he was writing about Europe, close to 100 years ago, 90 years ago, a long time ago. But that theme, the Huizinga theme, is true today. It's true that this is where we are today. I hope, for the sake of the people of the United States, that this is not inevitable, that because this is a country with enormous talent, enormous resources, and many people who are progressive and well-intentioned, who want the best for society, and that means for all of the people, not marginalizing the majority, so that the elites can prevail and have even more concentrated wealth. I hope that there are constructive solutions. Thank you very much for this session, for listening to this session today. Once again, I invite all of you to please subscribe to this channel. This is a channel that my good friend Asad Alim owns. He is education oriented. He is interested in the edification of the audience. He's interested in development of the human mind. And that's all this is. This is all about social and human development and educational development. And this is why I strongly urge you to support this channel and everything that Asad does. Thank you very much.